So, Micah, you're a journalist, you're an author, you're a researcher, and mainly into all these unexplained phenomena. So what kind of unexplained things have you looked into?
Well, personally, I've always been very interested in everything. I'm even outside of the unexplained and the unusual. I'm equally interested in global politics, economics, history, all these kinds of things. So for me, it's always just been a matter of pursuing all my passions. As I was just telling you, I'm a musician as well. But at a very early age, I began to really start to take seriously alternative models, which is funny because, I think when you're as early an age as I'm talking about specifically here, 5 or 6, you don't necessarily have such a background in what the conventional models would be, let alone an alternative. I think that for me it was always an interesting dichotomy, a kind of a parallel course, because I'm studying things in school, learning about conventional history, conventional approaches to science, mathematics, astronomy, all these kinds of things, at least in the schools where they still teach astronomy in the United States. But and then there's also this fascination. I remember, for instance, when I was younger, one of probably my very favorite, actually, subject was studying Architeuthis, or the giant squid. And I studied all about all the reports. It was known to exist, but we'd never seen one live. We'd never captured decent photographs of one. Now we have those kinds of things. And just within the span of my 30 years here on terra firma, we've seen and we've learned and we've discovered a lot more about the natural world. So for me, it started with the, literal pursuit of mystery animals, and those animals that in this circle, I guess we would call cryptozoological mysteries and things like that. And then from there, it took me to ancient mysteries, and looking at the concept that in ancient times maybe there were different kinds of technologies or different kinds of civilizations that were utilizing technologies that were not consistent with our present-day understanding of the historical record and what it entails. And so again, it was literally throughout my teens that I was reading about these kinds of things and studying sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and the potentials for there to be other aspects to our existence than what we know. And some of them may be stemming from a time so far back that it's difficult for us in modern times to find all the pieces of the puzzle, despite those out-of-place objects and things that turn up from time to time that maybe do point at a little something else. I always say I'm skeptical about it. I'm not going to tell you that I think aliens necessarily came down and built the pyramids, but I clearly think there's more than what our conventional model of history tells us.
And I think that skeptical approach is very good, to have an open-minded questioning, that you want to seek out the answers, but, keep an open mind to whatever you might find along the way.
Oh, certainly. I'm so often told by my friends who are more skeptical than I am, and I find it funny that there's a measure of skepticism that,
Yes.
And I don't think it actually has far less to do with a person being more skeptical or less skeptical. I think what it is that a person is more or less ideological. A good skeptic is a person who won't rule anything out, but who will err to what the facts can tell us. And unfortunately, there's so much misunderstanding that comes in between. I think a lot of skeptics in the modern world wouldn't agree, but I'll point out exactly what I'm talking about. When I say, for instance, UFO, I've had friends, in the skeptic circles say that's make-believe. And I've said it's make-believe that an unidentified flying object has been seen by maybe a military pilot or even, a commercial airlines pilot. No, it's not make-believe. What it is it is trying to grapple with terminology and trying to describe, for instance, an unidentified or unknown quantity that appears to be physically, representative here in our reality, and that doesn't necessarily mean aliens or extraterrestrials, but modern usage of the term UFO has come to mean that, very sadly. It's kind of been hijacked, especially by media organizations and things like that. And so when I say I'm a UFO researcher, I'm a UFO researcher every bit as much and perhaps no more than, perhaps an airline pilot who sees something strange at a distance that appears to be a bright shimmering light over the horizon. He doesn't feel that it's a pilot, and with 1,200 something hours in the sky, he knows better than to think it's this, or this. And it being an unknown quantity, he pursues the mystery on the grounds that I don't know what I'm dealing with, but I have observed some sort of phenomena that strikes my curiosity. That, again, is, I think, the essence of all this. And I'm, again, very skeptical in the sense that I will acknowledge people see unidentified flying objects. I've found no evidence that they are aliens coming down and beaming people up and abducting and cutting up cows and things like that. That may be the case, but, we haven't got hard scientific proof that, according to our conventional models of consensus reality, allow us to confirm those things. By the same token, I won't rule them out because there's at very least some sporadic data that is gathered over time that points to that possibility. It just doesn't confirm it. And so without confirming or denying, I look at what the facts entail. And the best I can tell you, April, is this. In our world, in our reality, we are faced with a variety of unexplained phenomena. We cannot quantify them conclusively as being this or that. We can only label them as unidentified at present. I think that it's because our science at present is unable to fully account for these things, but at some point as we advance technologically, we will come to a better understanding of various natural and perhaps potentially unnatural or manufactured technological phenomena that we from time to time observe. But for the time being, they have to remain unidentified, and that by dismissing them and saying if we cannot understand fully, then it doesn't exist, that's not getting us any closer to an answer than merely going around and believing based on belief alone that there are aliens abducting people. You know, that may be the case, but again, I withhold that judgment as a skeptic, but I won't rule anything out, and I'm not going to dismiss people's claims based on what I do or don't believe.
Sure. And I think there's that human tendency when we don't understand something to just push it to the too hard basket and leave it. But I mean, something like UFOs in the past was taken quite seriously. I mean, there was the Project Blue Book in the United States run by the Air Force, where they had an official body that was investigating sightings of unidentified things. And of course, that's very important from a security point of view. If you've got something unknown flying around in your airspace, you really need to know what it is. But that was sort of just very quickly shut down in the 70s, or I think 1970. And after that, it seems to have become something like, oh, don't talk about, you know, UFOs, little green men. It's something that has become, you know, people make fun of it or put it down. Why do you think nowadays this is taken less seriously compared to the past?
Well, you know, I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that, to an extent, various official organizations and the media have probably worked with intention of literally taking the UFO subject and downplaying it and making it a non-item, or at very least making it water cooler, something that you'll see in the strange or the weird news section of your newspaper, if your newspaper has that, and those sources usually appear online. I think that when we look back especially to the late 1960s, you know, we see there are people who, if their testimony is to be believed, you know, retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard French, who recently gave testimony at a rather controversial mock hearing that took place in Washington, D.C., called the Citizens Hearing on Disclosure. The retired Lieutenant Colonel French had said that during the late 1960s he had actually been employed by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which at the time had been overseeing Project Blue Book, and he had said that he was instructed to report on UFO matters, but to author the reports in such a way and word these reports that he actually compiled and composed in a way that downplayed the idea that there was anything legitimate to it. Furthermore, we see the same thing. There was a very popular memorandum. Well, I don't suppose it's very popular to just anyone, but I think that serious UFO researchers know about it, and I mention it in my book, The UFO Singularity. It was written by Robert Lowe, who had been one of the members of what became known as the Condon Committee. He had been one of the acting officers, if you will, who had been overseeing the University of Colorado UFO project, which was essentially this. Project Blue Book, the Air Force is handling UFO queries. They're gathering data. They hand it off to a scientific organization, and that organization comes out publicly and says that they find no scientific merit to furtherance of UFO studies, which I agree with to an extent. In terms of where they were going with it then. I don't agree with it now, and we'll get to that in a moment. But Robert Lowe, in his memorandum, which was not intended for public viewing, it was leaked later, he literally states that he was hoping that what they could do with the University of Colorado UFO project was to try and make it look like a bunch of serious scientists with no hope whatsoever of ever coming across any evidence of a flying saucer or a UFO. When a witness would say that they'd seen a landed craft, or if they'd seen individuals, persons standing around a craft, persons I say, because we don't know necessarily what these saucer entities might have been. And although I think that there were some credible reports of landings and also entities outside of a landed physical craft in the Blue Book data, but nonetheless, the intention was to take those kinds of reports and say, okay, these people may be suffering a psychological issue. They may be suffering from some other sort of stress or something like that. And they would essentially do everything they could in their analysis to downplay the idea. This is knowledge, and this is, as some would say, on record by virtue of a memorandum that Robert Lowe had written. And of course, it was no surprise later on that despite this and despite similar comments that had been made before the release of the findings of the project by Edward Condon himself, at the conclusion they find no scientific merit to the furtherance of studies of UFOs. Now, coming back to that point briefly, April, I will say that the Ministry of Defense during the 1990s, overseen by Nick Pope, at least in terms of the UFO collection of UFO data, it was also determined then that it was a waste of resources to continue to try and pursue a phenomenon that we couldn't reconcile with. That doesn't mean that UFOs don't exist or that there's not an actual valid and real phenomena. But what I feel is that the Condon Committee in the 1960s and then subsequently in the 1990s, the Ministry of Defense in the UK, they both probably felt that we're putting a lot of time and effort and money into studying a phenomenon that is so far beyond us that we cannot reconcile with it, and we cannot come to a final determination on what it is, and so we kind of want to have to wash our hands with it or from it for a while. I feel that Project Blue Book wanted the same thing, that they wanted to be able to wash their hands of this, and hence it was handed off to a scientific organization with the intention of downplaying it so that we could sweep it under the rug. And why would we benefit from sweeping it under the rug? Because I think that intelligence agencies and military bodies have probably largely come to, at the very least, the determination based on data that UFOs don't present a direct threat to humanity, and if they did, we would have more evidence of that. And without there being a direct threat, we can't spend a lot of money worrying about them. We can only acknowledge, okay, they're here, and there's not a lot we can do about it other than observe. Aside from that, I think beyond the public eye, very clearly there have been continued efforts to monitor and observe the UFO phenomenon. Some of these channels include everything from civilian organizations that occasionally, I think, including the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, and before that I guess it was probably before that NICAP. But there are others today, as well as the National UFO Reporting Center that Peter Davenport and others maintain and manage. I think that from time to time, data collected by civilian agencies may be either directly passed over to or more likely monitored by government agencies, because, again, if there's a civilian agency with interest in the phenomenon that's gathering data, why not go to them? If they have all that information, governments can all they have to do is, click a link and go to a website, and they can obtain information about some of the finest UFO reporting going on out there, including Peter Davenport and his folks at the New Fork. But I think that the other aspect of this, too, is that there are agencies. Robert Bigelow and Bigelow Aerospace have been known to be connected with collecting UFO data and things like this. And I certainly feel that certain private entities, such as Bigelow Aerospace, are probably gathering that data. And through certain channels, it may be supplied to other agencies that have continued what Blue Book was doing, or the Air Force had been doing with Blue Book back in the 60s. So I think that UFOs are both real and acknowledged, but they're downplayed to an extent essentially as a liability issue. We don't want to have to worry about this and have to spend money on this, and so let's just make it look like there's nothing to waste money on and worry about. And I think that's largely what's happened for the last several decades.
Mm-hmm. And that's quite interesting, considering that there's quite a high frequency of reportings around military bases or associated with bases. So where weapons have been shut down, or there's actually been a legitimate security threat. So it's quite interesting that governments wouldn't want to put time and resources into investigating that, where it seems like, there is something really valid that they need to look into there.
And I would say that in all likelihood, government is behind the scenes looking into the UFO phenomenon. Without question, I'm certain that they are to an extent. And when I mean an extent, I mean that I think that there is active data collection, but I don't know that there is an active pursuit of, a motive or a source behind the UFO reports. For instance, if you look at an agency that's, not often, I guess actually by virtue of the space program, NASA is certainly connected with space flight, but you wouldn't necessarily look at NASA and say, okay, this is an agency that's out there collecting data on UFOs. But in truth, they do. And here's how. There's what's known as the Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS. And this has been modified or moderated rather by NASA since I think maybe the late 1990s, early 2000s. And essentially the idea here is that when an aviation professional, whether it be a military or more often a civilian pilot, is flying along and they see something and this doesn't have to be UFOs by any means. It could be an electrical malfunction. It could be a weather phenomenon. It could be, a problem with landing lights, runway, mostly technical issues. But oftentimes when there's something that is potentially, life-threatening or just otherwise extremely dangerous that is observed in relation to aviation, people, tend to worry about, well, if I report this, could litigation become involved, or could there be, other factors that might make it less, beneficial for me to report on something dangerous that I've observed. And so it became well known, at least by the 1960s, I think, that agencies like NASA and the FFA had begun discussing, well, maybe we should make it so that people who are pilots and who want to report can do so anonymously. And so an agency like the ASRS was born, in which we have a database that is collecting data from people anonymously that nonetheless contributes to solving problems that could be hazardous for pilots and for aviation professionals. Now, what's interesting is that combing through the ASRS databases myself, a few colleagues and I have found numerous mentions, and these are all publicly available databases, of course. There are numerous mentions of things that would, by lack of any better other term, they would have to be UFOs. They resemble missiles. Sometimes there's no clear description given other than a strange-looking aircraft that nearly collided with my plane. Sometimes they're described as lights. Sometimes they're described as saucers. That's in the extreme minority. But the point is that if you look at the classification data, there's a lot of terminology and acronyms and jargon that's used in the reporting. But one of the actual designations in the key available on the ASRS website in terms of determining what certain phenomena or certain events, would be classified as, is UFO, which is it has always meant it's unidentified flying object. And it's utilized by the ASRS database collection information because from time to time pilots do see things that, whether or not an alien craft, they may not be able to explain readily, and they are able to submit UFO reports. So it's interesting that this is an agency, or rather a database, if you will, that's overseen by an agency, in this case specifically NASA, and yes, they do collect information that they even at times designate as being UFO, under the known and understood meaning of that term. It was merely an unidentified flying object. So yes, certain government agencies do collect data on UFOs, and that's not really a big secret. The thing is I think that truly government collects that information, but they, according to people like John Alexander, seem to have very little interest in the alien equation. They collect the UFO data, and then, well, what gets done with it, who knows?
Sure. And you mentioned before about your book called The UFO Singularity. Now, what actually is the singularity? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, this is a slightly different concept. With regard to UFOs, you can tell I'm pretty nuts and bolts and practical when it comes to nuts and bolts practical reports of unidentified flying objects. And also when it comes to being skeptical, again, I'm not a proponent that, everything that we see flying around out there is an alien spacecraft. But like many others in the field, that would include my colleague Richard Dolan, of course, the very wise and well-worded Jacques Vallée, who's written a number of books on UFOs outside maybe just solely the context of extraterrestrial phenomenon. I think a lot of us who are serious UFO researchers in the field feel that there is nonetheless something that's going on, maybe in those minority of cases, that represents an extremely, extremely formidable and highly advanced technological, well, I guess it's just a technology. I mean, it's something that we cannot fully account for. I mean, we have something that we cannot fully understand, something that appears to be in our midst, and something that appears to be utilizing technology that exceeds what we know to exist. And, as you can see, even I, someone who studies this all the time, from time to time I have difficulty coming to terms with defining exactly what that is. It's a very complex level of phenomena that I think could be a number of things, ranging from an extremely advanced technological variety of phenomena to maybe at times also varieties of natural phenomena, plasmas, ball lightning, and things like that we don't have a full understanding of. And then there are some really far out things too that might include everything from time travel to dimensional phenomena. Again, that's a minority of cases, but there is a level of complexity based on eyewitness UFO data collected over the years that does seem to point to something else going on that we as humans have a very hard time really coming to terms with. And so for me, after a point, it became philosophy. I had to kind of take a step back with my interest in UFOs and say, I can't keep looking at this as being little green men, because I think that this is a logical leap of faith that many researchers are making. I'm not going to jump in there and say, if it's not this, then it must be this, and then throw out an equally implausible and absurd concept as a replacement, such as, okay, they're time travelers from the future. Now, I acknowledge that is one possibility in my book, The UFO Singularity, but specifically what I'm trying to do when I utilize that term UFO Singularity was actually kind of a combination of ideas that my publishers and I had been throwing back and forth. I'd mentioned on numerous occasions my interest in technological singularity, which essentially involves the creation of artificial intelligence, and we expect perhaps to be able to begin reaching levels of, at very least, if not artificial intelligence, varieties of technology that might amplify natural levels of human intelligence. They call that IA, intelligence amplification, so there are two, AI and IA. But we may begin to utilize that kind of technology within just the next few years, perhaps within the next couple of decades specifically. Ray Kurzweil and some of the popular transhumanists, or singularitarians, as Kurzweil calls himself, singularity proponents like Kurzweil, Benjamin Goertzel, PhD, and a few others often say that, yes, we're getting very close to that point where we're going to have AI and a host of other radically different technologies at our disposal. And so my feeling is that, well, we're already looking at a very radically different and vastly intelligent, perhaps more technologically advanced presence with UFOs, some of these cases. And if that's the case, and if this is where we expect to be in 20 years, and we're already observing a technology that exceeds what we know to be human levels of technology here on Earth, I began to see a continuum between the concept of technological singularity, transhumanism, and, yes, the UFO phenomenon, which I'm surprised that more researchers don't make that direct connection. Having written the book, and it's been out for almost a year now, I've had time to compare notes with a lot of researchers. Again, my aforementioned colleague, Mr. Richard Dolan, the UFO historian, and he's probably one of the best minds we have in the field right now. He, too, recognizes this parallel and often brings it up. He and I were on a panel discussion with Stanton Friedman back in February at the International UFO Congress, and before I could bring singularity into the conversation, Richard Dolan had said, I feel that in the future, once we reach whatever the futurists of today are calling this singularity, I think we will have a fuller understanding of not only the reality around us, but also potentially of the UFO phenomenon. And so in a nutshell, I think he said it best, and I'll leave it there to say that that is in essence what the UFO singularity is. It's observing the connection between our trends in technology today, where we expect to be in the near future. And, of course, observing and I think also attempting to come to terms with what appears to be a highly advanced technological presence in our midst already, which is the UFO phenomenon.
That's really interesting. So this theory, does that really suggest then that at least some of these objects that are unidentified are actually human created? Yes,
absolutely. My feeling is, and again, I think that I've learned over time that this is such a difficult concept to try and come to terms with, and to even to orient verbally. I mean, we literally don't have, I think, all the terminology that we need to delve into the complexities. And again, there begins to be a bit of a dichotomy. We can talk about physical UFO craft all day, and I can tell you that these appear to be technologically controlled, mechanical objects capable of flying, occasionally plunging into and traveling underwater and things like this. And we can define UFOs fairly easily within what our semantics, within what language allows. Jacques Vallée had referred to a UFO as being very simply, a mechanical object that appears to harness an incredible amount of energy in a very small confined space. I like that definition. It's very scientific. It's simple. But I think that in terms of trying to come to a determination of the range of phenomena associated with UFOs, we do get into the realm of discussing consciousness. We get into the realm of discussion, discussing evolution and of course human origins just as well. Most people, again, who are of the modern skeptical ilk, they don't choose to look at those components to the UFO mystery. I think that they would perceive that as being related to abduction and things like that, and that's not necessarily what I'm getting into. I'm getting into the apparent interconnectivity between what we perceive as being a technology that exists in our midst and yet which transcends what we know to exist, and then reconciling with that psychologically, philosophically, spiritually. UFOs have come to represent a lot of things for us, April. They've represented everything from religious icons to certain cults that have emerged over the years, and religious organizations, even some large mainstream religious organizations, which I wouldn't hazard to name right now. We also see that UFOs represent, I think, a scapegoat for us as well. What we cannot explain and come to terms with about our ancient past, whether it be the building of the pyramids or the construction of advanced city sites that may have existed more than 3,000 years ago, especially in parts of the modern day Middle East, Pakistan and things like that. I'd mentioned Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa earlier. When people are confronted with mysteries of the ancient past that they cannot explain, they often kind of look to UFOs as a sort of a scapegoat. This explains all of the problems that we have, and if we cannot reconcile with one variety of phenomena, we could just say UFOs were behind it, or alien intelligences, and that they've been here all along. Now, for all I know, or maybe that is the case. I haven't seen direct proof of that, but I see that UFOs have begun to play a very important cultural role for us, to the point that, and I was talking with a colleague of mine the other day, and I said, Laura, I don't think that UFOs would have to even exist. It could literally be a mythos, entirely a mythos. A modern myth of things seen in the skies, to quote Carl Jung. But that would not remove the influence UFOs have had on our society and culture. So, coming back to your question, I do think that we have to look at UFOs as being something that are literally some technological, earthbound, terrestrial intelligence. Yes, absolutely. But by the same token, they don't even have to exist at all for there to be an incredible influence that they've had on our culture, and that we have to understand that non-physical interrelationship with a perception that we call a UFO phenomenon, what we perceive as being something tangible and physical, and the levels of complexity and interest and influence that they've had on our culture as humans. And it almost gets around to being a chicken or the egg kind of a thing, because again, I talk about singularity and how technology is trending right now and where we expect to be with artificial intelligence and things in the coming years. What's interesting is we see, this latest revelation, of course, was that the CIA has now officially confirmed the existence of Area 51. We've all known that for a long time. But it's spurred a lot of discussion about existent human technologies that have been utilized over the years. One famous one that had made the cover of Popular Mechanics earlier this year, I think the January issue, had been what was known as the Avro car. That was a project, I think, that had been jointly working between the Canadians and the United States. It was a very crude flying saucer design, and I don't think it was very successful. But what's interesting to me is that people of the skeptical ilk today, again, will look at that and they'll say, see, yes, as April was just asking about, we have historical precedent for the creation of technologies that match what are known today colloquially as flying saucers, and hence they must all be earthbound. They must all be terrestrial, whereas the objects that are actually allegedly seen flying at tremendous speed, plunging into the ocean, hovering over military bases and nuclear weapons sites, those are not objects that are consistent with what the Avro car and similar very crude saucer designs that our government and other governments have been working on decades ago were capable of. And hence what I have to wonder is there an actual phenomenon, and has that phenomenon and its apparent presence influenced human engineers who will continue to try and replicate that phenomenon, and thus steering to an extent human evolution and human technology toward this singular point that Werner Vinge and Ray Kurzweil and myself and others talk about? Or is it that the perception of a phenomenon, whether or not it exists, has done the exact same thing? So which came first, the man-made saucer or the saucer that we perceive as being something otherworldly? It's really, truly very fascinating.
It's a very philosophical issue at the same point. It's scientific and philosophical, really. And historical. I mean, you mentioned about ancient history, all these amazing places where there's lots of unexplained things going on. I mean, in many ancient cultures, there've been carvings of UFO-type objects, and it seems like these ancient cultures are depicting things that they've seen in the skies. Would you say that this phenomena of things that we can't identify in the skies have been around, have visited us for thousands of years, or would you say it's a newer phenomena?
Well, I've gone back and forth on that issue, April. I have in the past felt that it was clearly something that had been an ongoing presence, most likely alien. I think like a lot of more hopeful believers, feel when we enter the field. I have since then backed away from that and even wondered if there is a UFO phenomenon at all. The determination I've come to is yes, that there is, and yet again, it's in those minority of cases where we see this level of complexity that would be something truly beyond what we can account for with science and history. But somewhere in between, pure belief and pure skepticism, again, I find myself looking back at those reports of, for instance, medieval art or even cave drawings and things that appear to represent something that we, might recognize today as being ufological in nature. There are a couple of ways to reconcile with that. One is, as Carl Jung had begun to kind of elucidate with his work in relation to flying saucers, perhaps some flying saucers are actually a sort of projection, a manifestation. And that sounds absurd, I think, for the very hardline rational mind. I would see Stephen Hawking sitting there and listening to Carl Jung talk about flying saucers being a projection of a symbol of some sort. And he probably couldn't rationalize that entirely, aside from there being literally the presence of some sort of a psychosis in the mind of the observer that would lead to this. Because no rational person is going to walk down the street and be thinking about a wheel or a saucer or, or something like that, and all of a sudden project into the sky and literally physically interpret there being a UFO there.
And then, of course, there are the mass sightings as well, which wouldn't really explain that.
Which would, yes, and so then crowd consciousness and all these things come into question, For me, what it comes down to is this. I look back and I think that it's possible that there could be symbological elements, especially as represented in ancient art, medieval paintings and things like that, that we, through our cultural filters of today, interpret as being the modern mythology surrounding UFOs. By the same token, if we wanted to get a little further out, and it's funny because if I say this, I'm a crackpot. If Michio Kaku says this, he's brilliant. So let's pretend I'm Michio Kaku for a moment, talking about a time traveler coming from the year, 2079 AD, and traveling back in time to not just maybe the present day, where April and Micah are sitting here having a conversation, utilizing technology that bridges that gap, literally known as not just the Atlantic Ocean, but a whole half of a world away. Let's say that we travel even further back to prehistoric times, or maybe we'll jump forward a few hundred years and come back to the Middle Ages, and we'll look at perhaps what was happening there in medieval England in the 1400s. This apparent presence of whatever you want to call a UFO to a person of the 1400s in England is something truly extraordinary, and at very least on an observational basis, a person standing on the ground observing this might look at it and say, I've beheld an angel, or an angelic vessel, or perhaps a demon, a demonic vessel, who knows? I mean, they would probably interpret it as being something supernatural because it's so far beyond their frame of reference. We know what a ship is, according to the man of 1492, and that was what Columbus sailed to the Americas on. We wouldn't look at a UFO probably and call it a sky ship. I think it would more likely be interpreted as something religious. And hence, perhaps, if we wanted to equate this with time travel, or that UFOs are representative of a technology capable of evading temporality and traveling through what we would call space-time, then maybe a person of the year 1492 observing this object could interpret it and could reproduce it properly and very accurately, as some medieval paintings and the like do appear to do, and that could account for some of these things just as well. I mean, it's very difficult to really know what was in the mind of a painter, in the Middle Ages, who appears to represent what, to me, and I know that there have been a lot of reports and analyses that have claimed to debunk the presence of flying saucers in medieval paintings, but some of them do look pretty damn convincing, and they look so much like modern photos of even very hokey and obviously hoaxed flying saucers that one would have to say, gosh, at some point along the line, did people actually see these things? I don't think it's outside the realm of the possible. And again, we wouldn't have to leap to the conclusion that they were seeing aliens that were visiting Earth in ancient times. It may not be that at all. If time travelers were involved, it could be us visiting us in ancient times.
Yeah. And Micah, any idea about the purpose of, let's say that this theory of time travel is true, is correct. Any idea why, our future selves would come back into the past? Do you think that they have a goal, to try to change events, change the past, or you think it's simply a curiosity and experimentation of being able to go back and forth? Do you have any ideas about that, or any philosophical position about what's going on there?
I'm not entirely certain that it's intentional travel through time. I sometimes wonder if there will be highly advanced physics employed behind the mechanisms of aircraft, or if not purely aircraft, just various different devices and technologies of the future. And through the utilization of such advanced physics, I wonder sometimes if a byproduct of the operation of such technology could cause rents in space-time that we would perceive in the present day as the UFO phenomena. In that scenario, there wouldn't have to be an intentional modality behind the operation of a UFO craft. What we would perceive as an object flying through the air, in the year 3150 AD, again, that could be perhaps a little bell-shaped device sitting in someone's living room that's, heating coffee at an exceptionally fast rate for them. I don't know. But the point is that I wonder sometimes if rents in space-time are not the unintentional byproduct of advanced physics utilized in the future by our eventual progeny. Another way of looking at this, of course, though, is to be a little anthropomorphic about it. And again, people might laugh when I say that because it's easy to say we anthropomorphize when we think about alien life, and I often point this out. We often project human values onto what we presume alien life elsewhere in the universe would use. And so if I'm speaking about humans from the future, then isn't it a little absurd to say, well, okay, we're talking about ourselves, so why should we worry about anthropomorphizing how we're going to act and behave? But again, we have to take into consideration not only our present rate of evolution, but also how that may be helped along and even sped up through the utilization of technology in the future. This is a highly uncomfortable discussion for a lot of people to have. This definitely gets into the realm of singularity and transhumanism. But again, I wouldn't hazard a guess that the man of the year 3150 AD is going to be very much like you or I. We may not recognize them as being humans any longer, and that may be for good or for ill or for both relative to our perspective. But again, you can begin to see that a human of today, looking at the man of tomorrow, the woman of tomorrow, or the homo mechanicus of tomorrow, to borrow the terminology employed by a wise and noble colleague of mine, they may not necessarily be humans, and they may be more like the alien meme that we've come to recognize in UFO circles than the human that we would expect of tomorrow, or even the alien of another galaxy, for that matter. So, again, it's difficult to assert what a person or an entity, or at very least a conscious intelligence that far along, what their motives would be. Are they tourists coming back to look at us and observe us? Again, is it a technology that, as I've elucidated here, maybe is not intentionally creating the rent in space-time that we observe as UFO or high strangeness phenomenon from time to time? Who knows? But again, call me a crackpot if you want to. I think these are entirely logical questions to be asking. And again, speculative physicists do it all the time, and they've got a string of letters behind their name. I'm often ridiculed and criticized for trying to engage in very reasonable and I think also scientifically grounded speculation based a lot on what we know about physics and relativity and quantum mechanics and these sorts of things, all of which I tend to employ in my book. If you read the UFO Singularity, it's funny because my main detractors are people who are non-academics, especially skeptics or hardcore believers. In other words, the people who are the most ideologically,
extreme either end.
Yeah, the most polarized people ideologically are the ones that disagree with me. My chief proponents are people in government and people in academia who read what I write and have seen with the UFO Singularity that although I do quote Jacques Vallée, Whitley Strieber, and a few people like that throughout the book, most of my source data that I use for justification of the arguments I make actually comes from scientific journals, scientific papers, and a lot of reference material that you wouldn't typically see referenced in UFO literature. And so for me, again, I think that's the best way to try and substantiate a very bold and speculative argument, which nonetheless, yes, my UFO Singularity concept is that, but I don't think it's unreasonable speculation.
Sure, and I think it's quite refreshing to hear different perspectives and for people to be brave enough to put forward new theories, because that's what science depends on, is people, thinking in different ways, seeing things from different perspectives, and then investigating that and trying to find out the truth of things. Because if we only follow up one line of possibility, i.e. that UFOs are extraterrestrial, we might be missing another whole explanation that hasn't even been considered. So I think that's quite important.
Yeah, I think we're probably missing an aspect of, or several aspects of this mystery.
Yeah, it sounds like we could be. Now, Paradigm Symposium, this is something happening in October that you're heavily involved in. Can you explain a bit about what's going on there, what it's about?
Yes. Well, the Paradigm Symposium is a mutual effort between Scott Allen Roberts and I. Scotty, of course, is the founder and publisher of Intrepid magazine, and since founding and publishing it, of course, I assist him as an editor for the magazine and whatnot just as well, and also the thorn in his side that tries to get him to stay on schedule with things, and he's probably the busiest guy in this business, and he does a fine job with it. So, I mean, imagine trying to publish a magazine and put out, books, because he's also an author, Scotty, and then, of course, we're also planning this event. I can say to you, April, that really I don't think there's another event on planet Earth quite like Paradigm Symposium. Our first event last year, which was the first annual Paradigm Symposium, featured Eric von Daniken, the late Philip Coppens, who was a dear friend of mine, Giorgio Tsoukalos, David Weatherly, Nick Redfern, a lot of the brightest minds in the fields, and a lot of people who were in different areas of thought. This year we've diversified, I feel, even more. Some of our key speakers are Robert Bauval, the Egyptologist, Dr. Robert Schoch, whose theories of the Sphinx and dating the Sphinx back to much earlier times than previously thought. They're two of the speakers I'm most excited about. Scott Walter, also a very skeptical but open-minded researcher who has a program on History Channel called America Unearthed. P.Z. Myers, he's an evolutionary biologist and probably the staunchest skeptic out there today. I'm so excited about hoping that he will listen to me long enough to sit down and have a cup of coffee and chat, because you have to understand, April, I have so much respect for people like PZ, based primarily on the differences between our perspectives on what we perceive as reality. What's fun about just sitting down and agreeing with people all the time? He may be more, quote-unquote, ideologically skeptical than I am, but he's a brilliant mind, and we want that because so often I think that there's this kind of, with events in this particular genre, you see people propping themselves up with others who feel the same way that they do. They don't worry about justification based on scientific grounds or the merit of their theories. They worry about justification based on, how they feel that their fans and their fandom perceive them. And I see a lot of characters in this field, they're not so much concerned with actually making a logical case for what they're proposing, as they are just trying to kind of become, celebrities, if you will. With Paradigm Symposium, we've featured a lot of big-time celebrities, proponents of ancient alien theories, and again, evolutionary biologists and hardcore skeptics like P.Z. Myers. But the point of having that kind of diverse cross-section is to not just have a group where people are going to be propping one another up. Our intended focus and goal from day one, Scotty and I, has been always to try and create an educating environment, an environment that is going to challenge people's perceptions of reality and literally be paradigm shifting, and hence the name Paradigm Symposium. You come to Paradigm Symposium in October in St. Paul, Minnesota, this year, and you're going to be challenged, but you're going to learn and you're going to enjoy yourself, because I guarantee you that there's no event like it anyplace else. And of course, if people are interested, they can find it online at www.paradigmsymposium.com. You can also email me directly, info@gralienreport.com, and I'm happy to provide any information that people may need just as well.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for that, Micah. It was really fascinating.